Alright, hello guys, welcome, or if you've seen my channel before, welcome back. I am the Philadelphia Whovian, and now this video is going to be my third entry into my part of my channel I call Classic Corner. And my first one was on the Pride and Prejudice from the 1990s with Jennifer Ehle and Colin Firth. Then it was Emma versus Emma, the two Emmas I've seen with Gwyneth Paltrow and Kate Beckinsale. This one is going to be about the very first Jane Austen adaptation I ever saw that came out in 1995 in cinema theaters. It is Emma Thompson's Sense and Sensibility. Why am I calling it Emma Thompson's Sense and Sensibility? Because the screenplay was written by Emma Thompson, which she would later on win the award for Best Screenplay. If you have never seen Emma Thompson's acceptance speech for this screenplay when she won, you really should. It was awesome. I think the only thing I've ever seen when it comes to acceptance speeches that might have been as good as her acceptance speech for Best Screenplay is Halle Berry's acceptance speech for her Razzie Oscar, the Razzie she won, sorry, getting tongue-tied, the Razzie Award she won for Worst Actress in Catwoman, which I stand by Halle. Wasn't her fault. That was it wasn't a bad performance, it was just a bad movie. Very bad movie. But yeah. Only thing to rival Emma Thompson's acceptance speech for Sense and Sensibility is Halle Berry's acceptance for her Razzie Award for Catwoman. So, Sense and Sensibility, again, I believe it came out in 1995, so it's part of that 90s rush of Jane Austen movies, because I think the 90s, again, like I said before, had the rise of Jane Austen and Shakespeare adaptations or things that were inspired by Jane Austen. As we all know, Clueless was a fresh take on Emma as well, and God knows Shakespeare was all over the place. So, we have my very first ever Jane Austen film I saw, I believe, Sense and Sensibility. This is a very interesting one because the first two Jane Austen books I read were in my own free time. It was Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. I loved Pride and Prejudice. I mean, I remember it started from just like the first page. It just had all this action and activity, and it just moved. So when I got to Sense and Sensibility, I got into it thinking I was going to get that exact same action or that same type of speediness and immediacy to the dialogue and the same type of wit and charm. No. I mean, it's just no. I mean, it's Sense and Sensibility is Jane Austen. It's not her first novel she wrote, not at all, actually. But because the Northanger Abbey was, I believe, there probably were some other complete works. She didn't finish the Watsons. She pretty much did finish Love and Friendship and Lady Susan. But when it came to a full-fledged novel, you had Northanger Abbey, then you had Sense and Sensibility, which was originally written as Marianne and Eleanor. That was the original title of Sense and Sensibility, and when she first wrote it, if memory serves me correctly, it was written as a series of letters, Marianne and Eleanor. Then she went back and rewrote it and re-edited and reworked on it, and then it became Sense and Sensibility. So, like Pride and Prejudice was initially titled First Impressions, you had Marianne and Eleanor. They were written that way. Then Jane Austen, years later, she put in a desk, I guess, and years later went back and revisited them all, and then reworked on them and republished them. And that goes to show you that is just the editing process in a nutshell. Sometimes you got to just sit on things, and then we go back and look at them all over again. That's all you can do. Sometimes that is just all you can do. Nothing wrong with that. And I'm happy she did. Sense and Sensibility, be honest guys, when I first read it, I wasn't crazy about it. I just really wasn't. It just wasn't my thing, pretty much. I liked the story, but the way it was written, it was just very, it just didn't have the same flow as Pride and Prejudice. And it just, also the hero with Eleanor and, Mr. Edward Ferrars. I was told how they fell in love with each other, but I didn't see any dialogue in between them. And this continues quite often, where Jane Austen tells us that these people fall in love, we don't often always see it. It was the same problem I had with Jane Bennet and Mr. Bingley. Of course I felt a connection to Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. They talked, we saw their dialogue, but we didn't always see what Jane and Mr. Bingley said to each other. I was still fine with it, I'm just simply like, oh, well, I don't know what they said to fall in love. I know Jane Bennet is pretty, but that's not enough for me. Well, the same thing went here, where sometimes I was told people fell in love, or they had a connection, but I didn't always know why, because I didn't get any much dialogue between them. And that went for Edward Ferrars and Eleanor Dashwood. You didn't always see why they connected, because you didn't always get that much dialogue, but you were told they did. And then, Mr. Willoughby. Now, when Mr. Willoughby showed up, Mr. Willoughby, he did have more character. We did get more dialogue with him. Over time, we really did, and over time, it was perfectly enjoyable. So, once I got into the story and I began to understand that it's a different type of story than Pride and Prejudice, and it came out, Sense and Sensibility was written first, and Pride and Prejudice was written later, and you can see a development as a writer for Jane Austen between that novel and Pride and Prejudice. But I admit, when I first read Sense and Sensibility, I was not that interested in it. Then I saw this movie, and this movie changed everything. I loved Sense and Sensibility. I loved it very, very much. Very much. Just again, somehow Emma Thompson took what was happening in it, and she was able to produce believable dialogue for Edward Ferrars and Eleanor, and to see why they would connect and would fall in love with each other. She took the best of the John Willoughby scenes, and then she gave them to Marianne, and Marianne just jumps off the screen the way she jumps off the page. And you see, same with the youngest sister, Margaret, and Mrs. Dashwood, and then, of course, you have Mrs. Jennings, who, you know what? Mrs. Jennings is criticized in the book for being so chatty and voluble, but I love Mrs. Jennings, and I love Sir John Middleton. I love their personality and their charisma. I like talkers. That's why I'm a person who talks on YouTube sometimes. We're just voices howling out into the darkness because we have something to say, but we don't have often everyone to say those things too. We need to voice our feelings. So, I would have probably fallen apart in the Victorian England. I know this is set in Regency England, but sometimes I feel like we have the wrong impression of Jane Austen. Jane Austen was in Regency England. That's when she wrote, and people were talkative. People could be chatty. People like to talk. And during Regency England. But somehow in this one, it gives off the feeling that talking too much or talking too often makes you sound very buffoon-like. But I like a talkative person, because I am one. So I like Mrs. Jennings, I like Sir John Middleton, I like those guys. And then we of course find out that after Eleanor fell in love with Edward Ferrars, he was expected to marry well, and Mrs. Dashwood discovers this because of his sister Fanny, Edward's sister, who married these two's half-brother, who, when their father died, the father told his son, I believe it was John, is their brother's name, John, to look after his sisters and his mother-in-law, because their mother was their father's second wife, I believe, at least second wife. So that's why John, sorry if his name's not John, I believe it's John, they're his half-brother. They're his half-sister, because he had a different mom. On the day that he was dying, the father said, please look after my daughters and my wife, your stepmother, please. They only have a few £100s a year to live off of, nothing for the girls' dowries. You must help them. And the greediness of Edward's sister Fanny was able to convince John to give them nothing. That his father wasn't even talking about money when he mentioned, he said you should help them out. And you could see connection between that idea of slowly convincing her husband to not give them anything, very similar to how King Lear's daughters gradually diminished how much he had all throughout the times of, Goneril. And I want to say it's Reagan or Tegan, I want to say it's Reagan. How they were gradually cutting off all that he had. You could see a connection between that situation and this situation. So these sisters, Eleanor, fortunately, it turns out later on that not only was she not wealthy enough to win Edward's heart at all, but also he was engaged to another woman when they met. It was an engagement from years ago, to a woman named Lucy Steele. Who also had no money, so it was a forbidden love match. He attached to Lucy when he was being tutored in Plymouth by where he got his education, and that's how he met Lucy and fell in love with her. So pretty much Eleanor just keeps getting her hopes dashed against the rocks over and over again, and they get not only reduced in circumstance but also in situation. So they move from their huge, lovely, home on the country to a cottage on the estate of Sir John Middleton's estate. Which is Mrs. Dashwood's cousin. While there, that's where Marianne meets Mr. Willoughby, and that's when because she fell down when there was the rain, when she was walking or slash running in the rain with the younger sister Margaret. And Mr. Willoughby just rides up with his gallant horse, and he does help, and he does carry her home. And this has an incredible impression on Marianne, who is the side that is sensibility, is fueled by her romantic notions. And we find out, if you go and you look at some research on sensibility, in this time of Regency England, there was the idea of the school of romanticism. The school of romanticism was giving into your passions or believing that your emotions were always the truest guide to you, and that logic got in the way of you listening to your emotions. So your emotions were the most holy thing to listen to internally. And you have Eleanor, who is governed by logic, sense, and sensibility. So when this happened, and I finally saw this, I saw beautiful Emma Thompson as Eleanor, and amazingly gorgeous and awesome, yes, Kate Winslet as Marianne. And then you had, to my incredible surprise, Alan Rickman as Colonel Brandon. Okay. If you were me when you were a kid and you were growing up, you saw Robin Hood with Kevin Costner, Morgan Freeman, and I forget the actress who played Marianne. I should know her name because she was awesome. But what made that movie really work was Alan Rickman as the Sheriff of Nottingham. I was used to looking between that and him as Professor Snape in Harry Potter, and also him in Die Hard 1, I was used to looking at Alan Rickman as such a good villain. He's a great villainous character. And to see him very successfully play Colonel Brandon was amazing to me. It was absolutely amazing. And you have Hugh Grant. I think I said, yeah, Hugh Grant. Sorry, complete blanked on his name for a second. Hugh Grant as Edward Ferrars, and he does do a very good job as Edward Ferrars. And Mrs. Jennings, I believe Mrs. Jennings was played by Elizabeth Spriggs. And the actor who played Sir John Middleton, I believe I saw him. He played Cornelius Fudge in Harry Potter. And Mrs. Dashwood, she's an actress I believe played Madame Pomfrey in Harry Potter. But you see her in lots of other things, like she was in Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, and quite a few other things as well. I believe she also played Mrs. Fairfax in a version of Jane Eyre. She's a very, very, very good actress as well. Everyone is good in this movie. Everybody is good. Everyone is. Wait a minute. House was in this. Yeah, Hugh Laurie. Yeah, who played House from House MD. Also was in The Manager. No, sorry. Yeah, was it called The Manager? The Night Manager with Tom Hiddleston. Yes, The Night Manager. Yeah, he was in this. Mr. Palmer. And Imelda Staunton played Mrs. Palmer. Imelda Staunton, you would know from Shakespeare in Love, and also because she played Professor Umbridge in the Harry Potters as well. Very good cast. I'm sure there's some other great actors and actors I'm missing when I'm giving you this cast list. But this movie, and it was directed by Ang Lee, very well shot. The costuming was very good. The acting was very good. The script was phenomenal. It breathed life into all these characters and really helped me see them very, very well. So then I saw this movie so many times, loved it. Then I went back and read the book again, and I liked the book. This helped me really, really enjoy the book. This movie, yes, did help. So movies, adaptations can help sometimes. They really can. And also with Sense Sensibility, this one is Sense Sensibility is described, when it comes to Jane Austen scholars, as being the darkest of her books. It really is, because it has sorrow, sadness, like a lot of S words in there that was described by this one reviewer. She said it feels like it's the darkest. It really is. And I feel for Marianne because, and another reviewer said this, they really feel a connection to Marianne because she gets so thoroughly punished for her ways of being, but Marianne does have a good heart, and a lot of us are Marianne when we're her age. She was a very young woman. It often gets forgotten that Marianne was a very young woman. And she was very similar to how a lot of us are at her age, but also the reviewer said they sympathize the most with Marianne because she sees how the world should be in her eyes, and she wants to be the way it is. She wants it to be. And she sees the way she thinks the world would be at its best. That's what she wants. She's like, I sympathize with that. And also Marianne gets such a wallop for how she wants the world to be, or how she sees things, and how she wants to, really trust her emotions. And she's like, I sympathize with that. And I personally do sympathize with that as well. Our emotions, we can't help but fall prey to them sometimes. So I do sympathize with Marianne. I like both of the sisters in general. Margaret is another addition too, the younger sister Margaret. But what makes them great by the end of the movie, I think the movie does this a little bit better than the book, is it gives you the feeling that both Sense and Sensibility learn from each other. You could argue it does this a bit in the novel as well, but in the movie, when Emma Thompson, playing Eleanor, is crying over Marianne, when Marianne is sick and on the point of dying, and she's like, please try, Marianne, don't leave me here alone. You see Eleanor giving way to her emotions and showing her emotion. And you eventually see Marianne overcoming her sensibility, wisening up and becoming a stronger person and not letting her emotions lead to her destruction. And eventually choosing Colonel Brandon after she was jilted by Mr. Willoughby, who it turned out had run away with Alan Rickman's kind of ward, not his daughter, but the ward, who was the daughter of the woman he loved named Eliza. And then also he abandoned Marianne because the woman who was giving him his legacy, I think it's Lady Allen, she pretty much just took his legacy away from him, so he was left penniless. So to appease his debtors, he had to go to London and marry a rich heiress, which he did. So he abandoned Marianne for Miss Grey and her £50,000 to work off all of his debtors. But we do know that Willoughby will regret Marianne, but at the same time, Willoughby is a very dangerous character. And I found out later on he's even more dangerous than Mr. Wickham, because Mr. Willoughby has the ability to, even after you see the wrong he's done, convince you to still feel pity for him. He's like a handsome Gollum. What can I do? He is like a handsome golem. You know he's like a handsome golem because he even convinced Eleanor to feel a sympathy for him after he abandoned a woman where he left her penniless and with child. Yeah, Eliza. He somehow could convince Eleanor to still pity him. That's a dangerous character. It really is. But this is one of those books that has grown with me over time. When I first read it, wasn't crazy about it. Then when I read it again, liked it after seeing the movie many times, I loved it. Then I read it a third time, I was like, oh, I really do like this. But this movie made me appreciate the book. And that is a great, great feat. And fun little story about this one. This was also the first time I showed one of my boyfriends a Jane Austen film. And I knew he didn't like reading Jane Austen, but I put this in and I'm hoping he would like it. He literally commented on everything because Jane Austen, he said this really well, Jane Austen is all about subtlety, and film is all about subtlety. So when I read the book and I can't understand what makes it so great, but when you translate her to film, all those nuances and subtleties to everything come alive. And he was able to enjoy it immensely. Like, he commented on everything while we were watching this. Because, again, all of the subtleties in film work with the subtleties to Jane Austen herself. So yes, Sense and Sensibility. Great screenplay, very well acted, very well directed, and very well done. This is the very first Jane Austen film I ever saw. I mean, Jane Austen adaptation. So thank you so much, you guys, for watching. I think you were absolutely wonderful for doing so. And once again, I'm the Philadelphia Whovian, and you've now come and watched my classic corner once again. I hope to see you guys very soon. Bye, guys.